Important reminder that Trumpism is alive and well in the Republican Party, and election deniers are on the ballot for midterms in 27 states. Just last night, Trump spoke at a rally for North Carolina GOP Senate nominee and Congressman Ted Budd, who voted against certifying the presidential election in 2020, and he's declined to answer whether he'll accept the results of his race in November. This is what we're facing in November, guys. This is very serious. My panel is, of course, back with me. Jason, when it comes to candidates of color, there are far too few. People of color make up 41% of America, but only 28% of general election candidates. And political science research, you fancy yourself a political scientist, I believe,
heard that
yes?
before. My students at Morgan State believe that.
Ah, well, shout out to your students at Morgan State. But when people see people who are from their own communities,
right,
who reflect their lived experience, they're more likely to engage in the process. When do you think this disproportionality will change in our political landscape?
Well, I think in a lot of states it already has changed. I mean, the Democratic Party has basically become almost a black people's party in a lot of places in the South. Most of the candidates are increasingly African-American. Are
they getting support from the party?
Well, they get some support from the party.
Financially?
Financially, some. But the issue is, how strong is the state party, right?
Yeah.
A lot of times the state party is fairly weak. When I look at what Stacey Abrams has had to raise money, it's not just because Stacey Abrams happens to be a great candidate. It's also because a lot of the infrastructure in the Democratic Party has been eroded or basically just destroyed in places like Georgia and Florida. I think what's key, though, to pay attention, whether it's Mandela Barnes, who's running against a terrible possible insurrectionist in Ron Johnson, or Sherry Beasley, or Val Demings, or B. Wynn, you know, running in Georgia, or Raphael Warnock, we have to remember, people get concerned all the time when they see these numbers. These polls ain't loyal. I say that all the time. They undercount black voters and Latino voters all the time. So if you see Stacey Abrams down by 3, people are like, oh my gosh, you're going to lose. No, they're very likely undercounting black, Latino, and AAPI voters. Go out, vote, get active, get engaged. There are comebacks that are going to happen this fall. I promise you, we're not going to know who won on election night, but if everybody gets out and participates, a lot of these African-American candidates are in a fantastic position to actually win, and I am not usually an optimist, but even that is very clear in the numbers.
I was going to say, very rare moment of optimism from Jason Johnson. Crystal Ecclehawk, I want to talk to you because there also are not a lot of indigenous people on the ballot, yet we saw 3 candidates win their elections and, like we said last segment, have full representation in Congress. What stops people in the Native American community from running, and how might we change that aspect as well?
I mean, I think a lot of it is going to be investment in the infrastructure, right, to support people getting involved and understanding what it takes to run for office. It's always about money and access to capital, as we know about this political system we're participating in. And I think, you know, historically, Native Americans have not trusted the government for obviously very good reasons. In our poll, 95% don't trust the U.S. government. But I think there's been just a seismic shift, starting with the election of our first 2 Native American women to Congress, Deb Haaland and Sharice Davids back in 2018. And I think you've started to see a surge of Native candidates starting to run for all levels of office, which why now we have historic representation with 6 members in the House and our first Native American cabinet secretary. And the treasurer of the United States is a Native American woman who was also sworn in last week when Mary Patola was. So I think, yes, we are lagging behind, I think, other communities. And I think it does take real investment in that infrastructure. But I'm seeing a lot of momentum in our communities, particularly by Native women wanting to run office and looking at ways that we can continue to build power for Native Americans and also make a difference on all key issues that we all care about, like climate change and racism and healthcare.
Yeah, I mean, those are also issues. I think Fernand made a really good point earlier about some of the kitchen table issues that people are taking with them into the ballot box. But, you know, you look at your screen right now. I want my viewers to look at your screen right now. And this is a big reason why you have election deniers on the ballot. This is a big part of the fear that drives people to vote, because if people who are on the screen right now are gaining power, that must mean that they are losing power. And so I'm curious to hear from you, Brad, as we look at these election deniers who are on the ballot, who've been able to advance to November elections. I mean, our democracy really is fragile right now. What will it take, you think, to save that? I would argue the communities that look like the folks on the screen.
It's exactly right. I mean, look, Republicans have so run out of ideas that they're acting like my 7-year-old son. When he knows he's not going to win, he cheats. And so, you know, let the world know that, you know, I may not accept these election results. And it didn't work, but it kind of did, because a very large percentage of Americans still today believe that Donald Trump should have won, that somehow these election results were rigged. It is the worst, ugliest, most cynical kind of politics, and it's working. And so, the two things, exactly what you said, communities of color, to get our communities of color out to vote, we have to do a better job, right? And I will say this, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have been leading. The Democratic Party on policies have been leading. But when it comes to actually investing in explaining, educating, and firing up our communities, it's been lacking. So I'll just say that. But the second thing is secretaries of state races. There are so many competitive races. I know you and Jason have been talking about this. Jason just mentioned B. Wynn running in Georgia. These are elections. This is our last line of defense, y'all.
Yeah.
Right? These are the folks that are going to count these ballots and ensure the election integrity. And there are a lot of really important races in Colorado, in Nevada, in Arizona, in Georgia. API Victory Fund, we're going all in for B. Wynn in Georgia, all in for Steve Hobbs, another Asian American candidate running for Secretary of State in Nevada. So these down ballot races matter, right? And again, it's sad that we have to think this way. It's sad that we literally have to be thinking about, can our democracy survive, right?
Yeah.
Can our democracy survive? And these races are very important. If you're watching at home today, please donate to these candidates. Please donate to these Secretary of State.
$10 makes a difference.
I
often tell people when you max out, that's a check the box. But when somebody is sending you $10, that's a vote from a voter.
Yes.
Fernan, you and I want to bring you back for another show on another day to talk about polling itself. One thing that we talk about a lot is how can you trust the polls? Because one week somebody's up, the next week somebody's down. So just curious from you, because we've talked, polling communities of color sometimes is its own science. You have really interesting thoughts. You should write a book about that. Really interesting thoughts about how that works when it comes to polling. So what's your advice to folks who, sometimes polling drives voter turnout when they're like, oh, it's a wash, so I won't vote, or it's close, I might vote. Your thoughts there?
Oh, Tiffany, you're so on the money. I've always said this, all polls are not created equal. There are some polls that are a lot more scientifically rigorous. I can't agree enough with what Dr. Jason Johnson said earlier, because they do undercount a lot of these communities. I'll give you a quick example. I'm not going to name the pollster, but they were very ominous-looking polls that came out this week for the Democratic Party in some states. And I looked at the methodology. They didn't poll in Spanish in states where you have tremendous Spanish-dominant voters, which means that they're undercounting the Democratic candidate by 1, 2, maybe even 2.5, 3 points. In races that are decided by less than 100,000, 200,000 votes, that's the difference right there. So, yes, I would say you cannot look at every single poll equally, and it is incumbent on all of us, whether or not the Democratic Party is investing as they should with communities of color. I'm 1 to 10 to agree. They don't do as much. We cannot allow that to be an obstacle this time. All of us have to make sure that we, as on our own, engage our networks, make sure everyone we know in the community is aware of what's going on and what the stakes are, because I'll say it again, we may not get a chance to vote in another free and fair election in this country after 250 years if we don't get this one right, Tiffany.
Yeah, very terrifying. Well, this was a great conversation. I'm so happy to all of you for joining. So thank you, Jason Johnson, Fernan Amandi, Brad Jenkins, and Crystal Ecclehawk, not just for being here, but for what you do to uphold a democracy in a country that sometimes goes out of its way to make us not feel like it's our home. This is our home. We built it, and we're going to uphold democracy this coming election.